Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. This is the second take because I had to clear my throat as soon as I started the last video. Um, Given that I just live with animals and I don't see anybody for sometimes days at a time, I barely speak. Um, I think and read instead and I listen to things, but I don't really speak. So yeah, and there's something to be said about um, whether avoiding language both mentally and in communication with others opens up new dimensions of thinking and new sensitivities to kind of what we're talking about today, which is eidetics and phenomenology. So, where this is part three of the Sartre lecture series, and there was some delay for different reasons with getting this next set of recordings finished. Um, so you should be able to see, let's get that showing there, and then this over here, and then I'm all set. So you should be able to see um, both me and the, if you're just listening to the podcast, then you can't see this, but if you're watching the YouTube videos, I wanted to make sure that this video had the best annotated PDF possible. So I went through and marked it up a lot more than it was marked up before. So I reread the entire text again. And that was kind of necessary anyway, just to make sure that I remembered and would identify all the details that were important in these videos. Um, so yeah, I'm just scrolling through the stuff we've already done. There's not too much from the two forwards by Sebastian Gardner. I didn't put a lot in the annotations. I did a lot of underlining, but and what also happened in this process was by rereading it and by sitting with different phrases over and over again and thinking about them in conjunction, um, I just familiarized myself with it more and grew to understand more of its complexities. I'll honestly say, like, some of the guiding questions, I think, especially in part three, the one guiding question that I've offered, um, it's the right one guiding question for the overall part three, but there's a lot more that happens, and you could list a lot more questions. Now, that's the main question. How does emotion as a transformation of the world open the doorway to um, seeing that the world is fundamentally magical, encountering the magical world with our magical attitude. But I didn't catch those other few things in the text more specifically until I went back through this time. So yeah, I'd say the more specific contours of part three, which is like 30 pages long, 25, 27, 28. Um, it's 34 to 61, but it's inclusive of both ends, even though it doesn't quite start at the top of 34. Anyway, uh, he starts with an overview. This is really like something later in the video that we should talk about after we've covered the introduction and um, parts one and two. But in part three, there's discussion of thetic and non-thetic consciousness, positional consciousness, an overview of the emotions, and of just a handful of emotions. Um, and then the way that we use our body to ritualize these, and the way that it's a form of magic to maintain our own freedom, really. Um, Stuff that won't really make sense to you until we read chapter two, maybe, about the necessity of consciousness to be a transformation of itself always, and so the world is always a transformation too. Um, Instead of thinking that I move across a grid, it's actually that I'm perceiving a constant transformation of the whole. And this has a lot of consequences for the nature of reality for Sartre, and for phenomenology, kind of in general. But it's why he's able to ultimately say that emotion is a transformation of the world, because the world is my relationship to it. It's not just, there's never any kind of world without me interpreting it or feeling it or willing it. Um, his sketches of the emotions and his interpretations of them help to get us in the frame of mind where we can see the world in that way, or we can see experience in life in that way. Um, and he talks about the decay of the deterministic world. Well, he says it's a the that we engage in the emotions playfully or magically, but as serious beliefs that we otherwise cannot control and that we are non-reflectively conscious of, but that we undertake them as ways to, and we're responsible for them still because we actively undertake them, but we non-reflectively actively undertake them. So they don't have to be like reflective for them to be mine and for them to be my responsibility. Is one of Sartre's big points. And the distinction between thetic, non-thetic, positional, and reflective consciousness helps him make that point, amongst other things. It also lets him say, in a way more fascinating way, that um, consciousness of like this water bottle again is consciousness of myself, or is reflective consciousness only in the non-positional mode. So he'll say that water bottle tells me about consciousness, just like Descartes says that consciousness tells you about consciousness. He's kind of a Cartesian. Um, I think he is still somewhat of a dualist, but there's a unity multiplicity to the pluralism always, right? Um, and the unity of it is what grounds meta-ethical concerns, and the multiplicity is what constantly makes it fresh, exciting, pluralistic, unique to each individual, unique to each interpretation. So when we think about monism and dualism, they both have their problems, and it's really the unique dynamism between the two, or the combination of them, or like for Spinoza, there's one substance and an infinity of modes, and that's a unity multiplicity. So it's not quite, it doesn't collapse everything completely. And for Bergson, there's the dynamism back and forth between unity and multiplicity, just in discussion or in perception or in everyday life or in metaphysics and intuition, in thinking about the processes of things, etc. Um, and in Deleuze, there's the univocity of being, which is difference. So the one thing is a process of differentiating, which creates other things. In all of these, we see a unique combination of unity multiplicity, where the combination is not reductive to either one. It's not just one thing, and it's not just or things. Anyway, when Sartre sounds like a dualist, he's not necessarily falling prey to all of the uh, problems that, like, Descartes, for example, had. Um, he does not, in fact, need to reference the pineal gland to justify how the body can cause the mind and the mind can cause the body. Um, and that's kind of what, again, what we're talking about here. What is the nature of consciousness? How does it work? How does it influence? Are we free? Um, how does it influence the body? Does the body control it? So he doesn't attack those things directly, but he's using emotion as a way to begin the phenomenology to investigate them. And being in nothingness, like 3 or 4 years later, um, is a broader expose. And I haven't read it. I did get a copy recently with my um, teaching pay last year. Used some of that to invest in more research. And yeah. Okay. So I also spent time today doing like the whole notes process on like taking pictures of this. And I found out if you're looking at the camera, you can see, I found out that instead of doing like this and trying to keep it flat and then do that and that, it's actually easier to like hold it by the um so like the page I want to take a scan of, have it lay flat with gravity, and then the other page have it at a 90-degree angle and be holding that page. So you can look at the screen and see that, or you can just imagine it based on what I was saying. But that keeps my finger out of the frame. And the real issue was that um, whenever both pages were legible at the same time, I the Apple or the iOS or whatever was its AI or its auto scan technology was going beyond the borders of the picture I was taking, and so it was auto snagging the page opposite, which if I wanted to scan both pages at the same time, that'd be fine. But I was going for cleaner individual scans where people can read the annotations. So that took a while, and then I got faster at it, and it wasn't as bad. Once I figured out that method, the other method at first was really slow because it took a lot more cropping. And one time it even I actually lost a whole set of scans between the two methods. And then when I did the second method, it was a lot faster. I was frustrated at first for losing the scans, but it was a lot faster. Um, so yeah. I mean, this late in the semester, hopefully, um, I mean, this late in the semester, in future semesters, I would have put in the syllabus video how to take some good scans for uploading images. Winchester, stop looking. Um, so I'll just prime us with the guiding question again, but I'm not going to spend any more time answering it. And then we're going to jump into reading the introduction together. Why is phenomenology better suited than psychology to offer a complete account of human reality, the world as synthetic totality? Hold on, sorry. Sorry, he went straight back to licking his arms, and when he does that, he gets rashes, and I just constantly have to tell him not to do it. So why is phenomenology better suited than psychology to offer a complete account of human reality, the world as synthetic totality, and self-conscious subjectivity, i.e., consciousness? Right. So if you're watching the video, these are the updated annotations. I also um, tried to update some stuff on the website. I think this looks better with the smaller headings. And I still need to redo the teaching page. Especially I need to rethink the design for keeping the back end code clean while making it intuitive for students or people that just listen to the podcast or want to learn from me. Um, but yeah, down here you can see I've kept both versions of the annotations. We can open up the first one and see like there's not really anything. So for the four words, I had almost nothing underlined. Um, and then I have almost nothing in the margins throughout reading it. I don't know if that was because I thought I understood it really, because I did understand it really well, or I don't know. But that's not what we have now. Now we have something that is much more marked up. So I'll just kind of scroll through. You can see I've got like basically almost all the white space filled in the margins. Probably at least 50% of it. Sometimes it's just copying like phrases that Sartre says that I think are important or that are helpful. Um, and doing that again internalizes it for me. And so I think it's good for students to do that too. I think that's how you learn the material really well. It's how you internalize it, not just like memorize it for like one or two parts of it. I think that goes for anything. You just have to throw yourself into it. Um, but yeah, so changes to the website. Oh, and so for like, I didn't have a lot of the embed for the Phil 1301 like web page. All of these videos from YouTube are embedded, and the podcast video lectures aren't there at all. Um, the syllabus, yeah, in future semesters there will be like the syllabus will have a column on the schedule where it says what the podcast episodes are for that week. And that's the easiest way to keep up, to organize it and keep and for students to know where to go for each reading in each week. But it wasn't that organized this first time around, and right now I'm taking up time in something that should be focused for every semester, despite these uh, first time things. So that's everything. That's the update. Introduction. Psychology, phenomenology, and phenomenological psychology. So he's going to look at all three kind of in that order. He's going to critique psychology. He's going to start explaining phenomenology, and then he's going to explain why phenomenological psychology is the way to go, or what that would look like. Psychology is a discipline which claims to be positive. That is, it tries to draw upon the resources of experience alone. We are, of course, no longer in the days of the associationists, and contemporary psychologists do not forbid themselves to interrogate and to interpret. But they try to confront their subject as the physicist confronts his. We must, however, delimit this concept of experience when we speak of contemporary psychology. For there is, after all, a multitude of diverse experiences, and we may, for example, have to decide whether an experience of essences or of values, or a religious experience really exists or not. The psychologist tries to make use of only two well-defined types of experience. That which is given to us by spatio-temporal experience of organized bodies, and the intuitive knowledge of ourselves, which we call reflective experience. So, I'm not sure if psychologists still use reflective experience. This is 1939, remember? When there are debates about method among psychologists, they almost always bear upon the problem whether these two kinds of information are complementary. Ought one to be subordinated to the other, or ought one of them to be resolutely disregarded? But there is agreement upon one essential principle, that their inquiries should begin first of all from the facts. So he's going to have some critiques of facts, and not facticity or factitiousness, but of a strict positivism that will neglect self-reflective facts that are connected with the cogito and connected with essences and knowing itself with a perceiver. And if we ask ourselves what is a fact, we see that it is defined in this way, that one must meet with it in the course of research, and that it is always presented as an unexpected enrichment and a novelty in relation to the antecedent facts. And then from that definition, he's able to show that it can't be connected to other facts. We must not then count upon the facts to organize themselves into a synthetic whole, which would deliver its meaning by itself. In other words, if what we call anthropology is a discipline which seeks to define the essence of man and the human condition. Anthropology is the study of mankind. Whether or not they're seeking the essence of it and doing an eidetic science is an open question, but they're more flexible than some of the other social sciences. In other words, if what we call anthropology is a discipline which seeks to define the essence of man and the human condition, then psychology, even the psychology of man, is not and never will be an anthropology. It does not set out to define and limit a priori the object of its research. The notion of man that it accepts is quite empirical. All over the world, there is a certain number of creatures that offer analogous characteristics. From other sciences, moreover, sociology and physiology, we have learned that certain objective relations exist between these creatures. No more is needed to justify the psychologist in accepting prudently and as a working hypothesis the provisional limitation of his researches to this group of creatures. The means of relevant information at our disposal are indeed more easily accessible since they live in society, possess languages, and leave records. But the psychologist does not commit himself. So commitment is an interesting concept in Sartre. I say interesting because I'm interested in it, not because I can explain why it's interesting yet, but it's quite flexible. I think it's might be an existentialism as a humanism that he's kind of thinking about commitment in both perceptual terms and ethical terms. But the psychologist does not commit himself. He does not know whether the notion of man is arbitrary. It may be too extensive. There is nothing to show that the Australian primitive can be placed in the same psychological class as the American workman of 1939. I'm not sure if like he says these things in the best way. Like you could talk about like indigenous peoples and even the assumption that you want to compare them or whether they can be compared or using that, trying to critique the, even bringing up the notion of of the common assumption of a discrepancy between cultures that is significant, um, is kind of prejudicial because of its assumptions. But in the sentence right after, he says, or it may be too narrow. Nothing tells us that there is an abyss separating the higher apes from any human creature. So you would think that animals would be further off from any differences between humans in culture. Um, man, I really wasn't prepared to critique colonial prejudices. Again, Sartre is in favor of decolonialism in Algeria and survived World War II against the Nazis. So, you know, just trying to be sensitive here. Um, in any case, the psychologist strictly is forbidden to consider the men around him as men like himself. That notion of likeness, upon which one could perhaps build up an anthropology, seems to him foolish and dangerous. He will gladly admit, with the reservations mentioned above, that he is a man, that is, that he belongs to this provisionally isolated class. But he will think that this human character should be conferred upon him a posteriori, after the fact, and that he cannot, qua member of this class, or as a member of this class, be a privileged object of study, except for experimental convenience. He will learn then from others that he is a man. His human nature will not be revealed in a special manner under the pretext that he is himself that which he is studying. Introspection here, like objective experimentation there, will furnish nothing but facts. If later on there ought to be a definitive concept of man, which itself is doubtful, this concept is to be envisaged only as the crowning concept of a completed science, which means that it is postponed to infinity. Nor would this be more than a unifying hypothesis invented in order to coordinate hierarchically the infinite collection of facts brought to light. Which means that the idea of man, if it ever acquires a positive meaning, will be only a conjecture intended to establish connections between the disparate materials and will derive its probability only from its success. Peirce, who was a pragmatist, the first pragmatist, hopefully you remember that from our unit on James and Dewey. Peirce defined the hypothesis as the sum of the experimental results which it enables us to predict. Thus, the idea of man could only be the sum of the facts which it unifies. If, however, some psychologists made use of a certain conception of man before this ultimate synthesis was possible, it could be only on their personal account, and as a leading idea, or better, as an idea in the Kantian sense. Sorry, I could feel the pressure in my stomach like I needed to burp. Um, a Kantian idea is an idea, or an idea for Kant is a regulative concept, and he's about to say that exact thing. So, an idea is something that regulates other inputs, if I'm not mistaken. It regulates, um, I don't know exactly, but I think it's something like regulates the noumena into perceptual phenomena. Like takes the raw input, puts them in the 12 categories, and then you see what you see in front of you. But we're not thinking about all that transcendental structures, um, all of those transcendental structures, or all of that transcendental mess. Um, I find that you don't need it to do Sartre, and I find that Sartre is more fun and lightweight without it. So, in that same sense, I'm not going to read, all the annotations I took, but in the video, they'll be there. It won't be this blank page for the next 5 years. Um, if, however, some psychologists made use of a certain conception of man before this ultimate synthesis was possible, it could be only on their personal account and as a leading idea, or better, as an idea in the Kantian sense, and their primary duty would be never to forget that it was merely a regulative concept. It follows from all these precautions that psychology, insofar as it claims to be a science, can furnish no more than a sum of heteroclite facts. Heteroclite meaning diverse and um, of just completely heteronymous genera or types, meaning there's no overlap or communication possible between them. There's no connection possible, no fluidity or openness, no porousness, the majority of which have no link between them, no linkage between them. What could be more different, for instance, than the study of the stroboscopic illusion and the study of the inferiority complex? So, kind of makes sense. This disorder does not arise by chance, but from the very principles of the science of psychology. To wait upon the fact is, by definition, to wait upon the isolated. It is to prefer positively the accident to the essential, the contingent to the necessary, disorder to order. Remember that the definition of a fact is something that one must meet with it in the course of research, and that it is always presented as an unexpected enrichment and a novelty in relation to the antecedent facts. If it wasn't a novelty, you would have derived it already. And if you had derived it already, or if it was something you could have derived already, then it would not be a new thing. So how can we have things that are new, that are connected? Well, eventually consciousness has to be a transformation of itself, always. And what came before remains um, embedded in, carried on by, imbued in the same world we live now. But that's like end of the book. Uh, to wait upon the fact is to discard in principle the essential as something in the future. That is for later on when we have collected enough facts. The psychologists do not notice, indeed, that it is just as impossible to attain the essence by heaping up the accidents as it is to arrive at unity by the indefinite addition of figures to the right of 0.99. Um, if indefinite is meant as infinite, then that would actually get you to one. I take a break in my in-person classes sometimes to show the white some of the math behind it. But it's basically 1/9 plus 1/9. 1/9 is 0.11111, repeating to infinity. And you know that if you get 0.111 repeating up to 0.888, then you do that, you get 0.888, right? And you do it again, and that's 8/9. And you do it again to go from 8/9 to 9/9, which equals 1. But when you do it again, you get 0.1, no, 9999999. And that final one somewhere would crescendo it over. Um, because all the other ones have it there too. All they have the other infinite trail of um, I mean 0.99 infinitely repeating truly is its own thing. Let me say that. But there are arguments that say that it might not be. My question is whether carrying it on to infinity is the same as adding 0.11111 to 0.88888. Because I think there's that space in there at the very end between them, that gap that is filled. Um, I'm not sure if 0.9999 repeating still has that. But my mathematics majors students, please leave some comments. Tell me how this works. If their only aim is to accumulate observations of detail, there is nothing to be said, except that one can see little interest in the collector's labors. But if in their modesty they are animated by the hope, laudable in itself, that they will eventually realize an anthropological synthesis upon the basis of their monographs, then their aim is completely self-contradictory. They may say that this precisely is the method and the ambition of the natural sciences. So, a theory of everything is kind of what he's talking about. And to do a theory of everything, you would need an eidetic science, something that takes up consciousness as its own. The takes advantage of the absolute proximity of consciousness to itself. Otherwise, you'd always have this gap of unexplained stuff. That doesn't mean there's the self involved in it. The self is only involved whenever it's reflective. Uh, Whenever it's non-reflective, it's not about me. But yeah. So uh, the theory of everything in physics, or the theory of consciousness in psychology, or in um, cognitive science. So you could probably link up like quantum mechanics, physics, psychology, cognitive science, and phenomenology. And that's what we're trying to do. They may say that this precisely is the method and the ambition of the natural sciences. To that we must reply that the aim of the sciences of nature is not to know the world, but the conditions under which certain general phenomena are possible. It is a good while since the notion of the world has succumbed under the criticisms of the methodologists, just because we cannot apply the methods of the positive sciences and at the same time expect them to lead us one day to a discovery of the meaning of the synthetic totality that we call the world. But man is a being of the same type as the world. It is even possible that, as Heidegger believes, the notions of the world and of human reality are inseparable. Precisely for that reason, psychology ought to resign itself to missing human reality if indeed that human reality exists. Applied to a particular example, to the study of the emotions, for instance, what is to be gained from the principles and methods of the psychologist? First of all knowledge of emotion will be something additional to and outside all our other knowledge about psychic being. Emotion will present itself as an irreducible novelty in relation to the phenomena of attention, of memory, etc. You can indeed inspect these phenomena and the empirical notions that the psychologists lead us to form about them. You can turn them about as you will, but you will not find they have the slightest essential relation to emotion. However, the psychologist admits that man has emotions. He knows that from experience. In this view, emotion is primarily and in principle an accident. In treatises on psychology, it is the subject of one chapter after the other chapters, much as in chemical treatises, calcium might come after hydrogen and sulfur. As for studying the conditions under which an emotion is possible, inquiring, that is, whether the very structure of the human reality renders the emotions possible and how it does so, to the psychologist, this would seem needless and absurd. What is the use of inquiring whether emotion is possible, seeing that manifestly it exists? It is also to experience that the psychologist appeals in order to establish the limits of emotive phenomena and to define them. And, truth to tell, this may well awaken him to the fact that he already has an idea of emotion, for after examining the facts, he will draw a line of demarcation between the facts of emotion and those of a quite different order. How could experience supply him with a principle of demarcation if he did not already have one? But the psychologist prefers to hold fast to the belief that the facts fall into groups of themselves under his gaze. The question now is how to study the emotions one has isolated. To this end, it is advisable to produce some emotional situations or turn our attention to the particularly emotional subjects offered to us by pathology. Pathology being like case studies of people with quote unquote disorders, behavior, basically, case studies of behavior. We will then try to determine the factors in such complex states. We will isolate three things: the bodily reactions, which, moreover, we can establish with the greatest precision. Second, the behavior. And third, the state of consciousness properly so called. After that, we shall be in a position to formulate our laws and put forward our explanations. That is, we shall try to relate these three types of factors in an irreversible order. If I am a supporter of the intellectualist theory, for example, I shall set up a constant and irreversible succession between the interior state of consciousness considered as antecedent and the physiological disturbances considered as consequences. If, on the contrary, so the intellectualist theory thinks that the interior state of consciousness causes the physiological disturbances. And there's not much, it's not clear where behavior falls into that pairing. If, on the contrary, I agree with the advocates of the peripheric theory that, quote, a mother is sad because she weeps, I shall limit myself fundamentally to the reverse order of the factors. So the physiological states are antecedents, and the interior state of consciousness, feeling of sadness, an experience of sadness, is the consequence or is caused by it. Still, not much mention of behavior. Behavior seems to be this simultaneous thing. And he doesn't say that explicitly, but he does talk about um, behavior and functional uh, that some of our emotional behaviors function. We take up emotions purposively, and functional is that it's purposive, but it's also um, that it's a transformation. There's an input and you give it an input and it gives you an output. The world is constantly inputting and outputting itself, regenerating itself, resurging itself, developing itself, reorienting itself, reimagining itself, losing things here, gaining things there. What is certain in any case between these two accounts is that I shall not look for the explanation or the laws of emotion in the general structure of the human reality, but on the contrary, in the development of the emotion itself, so that even when duly described and explained, the emotion will never be more than one fact among others, a fact enclosed in itself, which will never enable anyone to understand anything else, nor to grasp by means of it the essential reality of man. So if you just did description without eidetic uh, insights or claims to takeaways from what is given on the surface or perceivable through the description, then you would be falling prey to the same thing as a psychologist. So don't misunderstand phenomenology reductively as just the mere description of phenomena, um, or an accounting of phenomena. It's not a presentationalism or a representationalism. It's incisive. The description has to tell you something about the general structure of the human reality itself, always. It was in reaction against the insufficiencies of psychology and of psychologism that there grew up some 30 years ago a new discipline, that of phenomenology. Its founder, Husserl, was first of all struck by this truth, that there is an incommensurability between essences and facts, and that whoever begins his researches with facts will never attain to essences. If I am looking for the psychic facts that underlie the arithmetical attitude of a man who is counting and calculating, I shall never succeed in reconstituting the arithmetical essences of unity, of number, and of numerical operations, without, however, renouncing the idea of experience. Since the principle of phenomenology is to, quote, go to the things themselves, and its method is founded upon the eidetic intuition, and thus, without renouncing the idea of experience, it must at least be made more flexible. Room must be made for the experiences of essences and values. We must even recognize that essences alone enable us to classify and examine facts. If we did not have implicit recourse to the essence of emotion, it would be impossible for us to distinguish, among the multitude of psychic facts, this particular group of the facts of emotivity. Since then we have anyhow taken implicit recourse to the essence of emotion, and it's not all just a big soup of noise, phenomenology prescribes that we make our recourse explicit, that we should fix once and for all, and by concepts, the content of this essence. It is easy to see that, for phenomenology, the notion of man can no longer be taken as an empirical concept, derived from historical generalization. So, not something man cannot be understood empirically through generalizing a history of evidence and case studies and accounts of other people's lives. But then on the contrary, we are obliged to make use, without saying so, of the a priori essence of the human being to give a fairly solid basis to the generalizations of the psychologist. Psychology, moreover, envisaged as the science of certain human facts, cannot be our starting point, since the psychic facts that we meet with are never prior. Those psychic facts in their essential structure are reactions of man to the world. They therefore presuppose man and the world, and cannot take on their true meaning unless those two notions have first been elucidated. So the classical conditioning is getting to the point where I press the button and the voice says like recording stopped, and he knows, I mean, he recognized the word stop anyway. And so, yeah, I was trying to be discreet about it because it's totally breaks the flow of the lesson, and nobody wants to just hear stop in the middle of me reading when I'm being like warm and fuzzy. Um, that can be really uncomfortable, I'm sure. He's like 10 years old. He's such a sweetheart. He's a German Shepherd. You good, Winchester? Hmm? You get one of his toys. How cute is that? Come on. Yeah. He's anxious. He's full of energy. That's why he's looking. I think he just likes my voice. Yeah. He forgets he has all these toys. I bought him like our floor is just covered in his toys. He has a green like Nerf football that I throw, and he has two tennis balls with squeakers, and you just saw that thing, and then he's got the arms that he ripped off of one of his other uh he's got two different sets of arms that he's ripped off of True Toys. Yeah, come on. So yeah, again, they therefore presuppose man and the world and cannot take on their true meaning unless those two notions have first been elucidated. If we want to found a psychology, we must go beyond the psychic, beyond the situation of man in the world, even to the very source of man, of the world, and of the psychic, to the transcendental and constitutive consciousness that we attain through a quote, phenomenological reduction or quote, putting the world in brackets. So we'll see how we're not really doing like too much of that. Um, Bracketing the world does not mean that you are putting the world at bay to just focus on specific things, although it can mean that. Um, it's more that you are bringing the world into you, or that you are, no, it's not that you're bringing the world into you. It's that you're putting yourself out in the world. I'd say that's probably the biggest issue with phenomenology is to think that the world is inside of you in some way. That was Heidegger's issue. Um, so no, we're doing an eminent phenomenology here, but that phenomenological reduction looks like an expansion of the self outward, like Bergson talked about. And Sartre was influenced by Bergson, so I think he might have this in mind. And again, Jean-Luc Nancy takes some of Heidegger's ideas um, about Dasein or being here, being there. I think it's being there, um, and reemphasizes the influence, not influence, reemphasizes the principality or the um, importance or the firsthoodness of being with or midside. So trying to again take phenomenology out of this particular body and make it something worldly rather than making the world just the consciousness, right? You want to invert it the other way. Through a phenomenological reduction or putting the world in brackets. It is this consciousness that must be interrogated. And what gives value to its answers is that it is mine. Husserl knows how to take advantage of that absolute proximity of consciousness to itself, which the psychologists do not choose to profit by. He takes advantage of it wittingly and with absolute confidence, because all consciousness exists precisely to the degree that it is consciousness of existing. But here, as above, he refuses to question consciousness about the facts, which would be to find the disorder of psychology again upon the transcendental plane. What he sets out to describe and to fix in concepts are precisely the essences which preside over developments in the transcendental field. Thus, there will be, for instance, a phenomenology of emotion, which, after putting the world in brackets, will study emotion as a purely transcendental phenomenon, not considering particular emotions, but seeking to attain and elucidate the transcendent essence of emotion as an organized type of consciousness. So in a way, you get to draw conclusions about the world based on your interior experience, and you get to draw conclusions about yourself based on the world. What kind of consciousness must be possible that I can engage with the world, that the world can be part of me, or that I can be part of the world? Um, Not just what must the consciousness be, but what must the world be? By seeking to attain and elucidate the transcendent essence of emotion as an organized type of consciousness. The absolute proximity of the investigator to the object investigated is also the point of departure for another phenomenologist, Heidegger. What must differentiate all research into man from other types of strict investigation is precisely this privileged circumstance that the human reality is ourselves. The existent that we have to analyze, writes Heidegger, is ourselves. The being of this existent is my own. Winchester. And it is no negligible matter that this human reality should be myself, because it is precisely for the human reality that to exist is always to assume its being. That is, to be responsible for it instead of receiving it from outside as a pebble does. And since the human reality is essentially its own possibility, this existent can itself choose what it will be, achieve itself or lose itself. This assumption of itself, which characterizes the human reality, implies an understanding of the human reality by itself, however obscure an understanding this may be. In the being of this existent, the latter relates itself to its being. She's going crazy with her little catnip ball. She doesn't always do that. She's had more zoomies lately. I think I told y'all she got shots and she has ulcers in the back of her mouth and they got fixed. So, feeling better. Anyway, let's go. In the being of this existent, the latter relates itself to its being. For indeed, this quote unquote, that's Heidegger. This is Sein und Zeit, but I presumably Sein like SEIN. Maybe being. It might be being in time. Okay. I just scared myself because I paused the recording and then minimized my Zoom with just trying to Google for something. Um, I don't speak German, but I'm pretty sure this is being in time. Yeah. And I wonder if we can see what he's using from Husserl. Probably phenomenological investigations, but I don't think he said it. So yeah, quote, in the being of this existent, the latter relates itself to its being. The existent relates itself to its being. For indeed, this understanding is not a quality that comes to the human reality from without, but is its own mode of existence. Thus, the human reality, which is myself, assumes its own being by understanding it. This understanding is mine. I am, then, first of all, a being who more or less obscurely understands his reality as a man, which means that I make myself a man by understanding myself as such, or a human. This is essentially a cogito. I can therefore question myself, and on the basis of that, except it doesn't maybe have the immediate persuasiveness of the cogito, but that self-knowledge is the same. I can therefore question myself, and on the basis of that interrogation, carry out an analysis of the human reality, which will serve as the basis for an anthropology. Here too, of course, the procedure is not to be one of introspection. Firstly, because introspection meets with nothing but facts. And secondly, because my comprehension of the human reality is dim and inauthentic, it has to be made explicit and corrected. In any case, the hermeneutic of existence will be sufficient foundation for an anthropology, and this anthropology will serve as a basis for all psychology. We are thus taking up a position opposite to that of the psychologists, since we start from the synthetic totality that man is and establish the essence of man before beginning our psychology. At all events, phenomenology is the study of phenomena, not of the facts. And by a phenomenon, we are to understand, quote, that which announces itself, that of which the reality precisely is the appearance. And this, quote, announcement of itself is not that of anything else. The being of the existent is not a thing behind which there is still something else which does not yet appear. Indeed, for the human reality, to exist is, according to Heidegger, to assume its own being in an existential mode of understanding. And according to Husserl, to exist is for consciousness to appear to itself. Since the appearance here is the absolute, it is the appearance which has to be described and inquired into. From this point of view, Heidegger thinks that in every human attitude, in emotion, for example, since we have been speaking of that, we can rediscover the whole of the human reality. For emotion is the human reality assuming itself and, quote, emotionally directing itself towards the world. Husserl, for his part, thinks that a phenomenological description of emotion will reveal the essential structures of consciousness, seeing that an emotion precisely is a consciousness. And reciprocally, a problem will arise that the psychologist does not even suspect. Can one conceive of consciousnesses which do not include emotion among their potentialities, or must we indeed regard it as an indispensable constituent of consciousness? Thus, the phenomenologist will interrogate emotion about consciousness or about man. He will inquire not only what it is, but what it has to tell us about a being, one of whose characteristics is just this, that it is capable of being moved. And conversely, he will interrogate consciousness, the human reality, about emotion. What must a consciousness be that emotion should be possible, perhaps that it should even be necessary? So he's going from emotion to consciousness and the nature of mankind or humans. Um, but I think he wants to ultimately say that part of each's nature is the other. And But then when we get to the other side, he equates consciousness and human reality and just goes back to emotion. Doesn't really mention the about man, unless that is human reality, and in which case, again, he's here just like collapsing them, not conflating and not reducing, but putting them on a transcendental plane together, at least. I guess you could say that. There's a common eidetic that pierces through both of them. We are now able to understand why the psychologist distrusts phenomenology. The initial precaution, so again, what must a consciousness be that emotion should be possible, perhaps that it should even be necessary? We are now able to understand why the psychologist distrusts phenomenology. The initial precaution of the psychologist is, in effect, to consider the psychic state from an aspect that will divest it of all signification. For him, a psychic state is always a fact, and as such, always accidental. This accidental character is indeed what the psychologist most firmly maintains. If we ask of a scientist, why do bodies attract one another according to Newton's law? He will reply, I know nothing about that, because it is so. And if we ask him, what does that attraction signify? He will answer, it does not signify anything, it just is. Similarly, the psychologist, questioned about emotion, is quite proud to affirm it exists. Why? I know nothing of that. I simply state the fact. I do not know its signification. To the phenomenologists, on the other hand, every human fact is of its essence significant. If you deprive it of its significance, you rob it of its nature as a human fact. The task of the phenomenologist, then, will be to study the significance of emotion. What are we to understand by that? Signification plays a big role in his arguments throughout, especially in his rejection of the unconscious. But again, I've hit these arguments a lot in the first two videos. I want to try to keep moving through the source text without just saying it all over again and over again. To signify is to indicate something else, and to indicate it in such a way that in developing the signification, one finds precisely the thing signified. For the psychologist, emotion signifies nothing, because he studies it as a fact. That is, by separating it from everything else. It will then be non-significant from the start. But if every human fact is in truth significant and signifies something and is significating and is a part of signification, this emotion of the psychologist is of its nature dead, non-psychic, inhuman. Whereas if we want to see emotion as the phenomenologists see it, as a true phenomenon of consciousness, we shall have to consider it as significant first of all. And this means that we shall affirm that it is strictly to the degree that it signifies. We shall not begin by losing our way in the study of psychological facts, simply because, taken by themselves and in isolation, they signify almost nothing. They are, and that is all. On the contrary, we shall try, by developing the significance of behavior and of disturbed consciousness, to explain what is signified. And what this is we know from the beginning. An emotion signifies in its own manner the whole of the consciousness, or, if we take our stand on the existential plane, of the human reality. It is not an accident, because the human reality is not a sum of facts. It expresses under a definite aspect the synthetic human entirety in its integrity. And by that we must in no wise be understood to mean that it is the effect of the human reality. It is that human reality itself, realizing itself in the form of emotion. Hence, it is impossible to regard emotion as a psychophysiological disorder. It has its own essence, its peculiar structures, its laws of appearance, its meaning. It cannot possibly come from outside the human reality. It is man, on the contrary, who assumes his emotion, and emotion is therefore an organized form of human existence. It's organized because it has a finality to it, but it's also, I guess, organized because we assume it, or the human assumes it. takes ownership of it. It is not our intention here to attempt a phenomenological study of emotion. Such a study, if we had one, would deal with affectivity as an existential mode of the human reality. But our ambition is more limited. We would rather try, in one defined and concrete case, that of emotion, to see whether pure psychology could derive a method and some instruction from phenomenology. We will not quarrel with psychology for not bringing man into question or putting the world in brackets. It takes man in the world as he presents himself in a multitude of situations, at the restaurant, in the family, at war. In a general way, what interests psychology is man in situation. In itself, it is, as we have seen, subordinate to phenomenology. Since a truly positive study of man in situation would have first to have elucidated the notions of man, of the world, of being in the world, and of situation. But after all, phenomenology is hardly born as yet, and all these notions are very far from a definitive elucidation. So you would start by having an account of phenomenology from the self-account of self-knowledge, and then outward from that intuition, whether Bergson or Descartes or Sartre, phenomenology, you can move out to the other sciences. I mean, this is really consonant with introduction to metaphysics. Um, and if Bergson has critiques of metaphysics, which he might, Deleuze might as well, I'm not sure, I don't remember. Um, at the very least, I think Sartre is accommodating of Bergson, and we could try to read them more specifically together in a written text somewhere. I don't know if I'll write that one day or what, but ought psychology to wait until phenomenology comes to maturity? We do not think so. But even if it does not wait for the definitive constitution of an anthropology, it should not forget that this anthropology is realizable, and that, if one day it is realized, all the psychological disciplines will have to draw upon its resources. For the time being, psychology should endeavor not so much to collect the facts as to interrogate the phenomena. That is, the actual psychic events insofar as these are significations, not insofar as they are pure facts. Note also that collect is a sort of passive thing that you don't modify, whereas an interrogate is a discursive act that is interpretive. You direct it and you take something from it and then direct it again. But if directing it is an active activity that consciousness makes from this side, and um, how we interpret it or how the world makes itself or the exigencies I feel are a way that the world makes itself from that side, then directing um, and interpreting become the same thing. My necessity of interpretation from the world's perspective is my agency from my perspective. And I think Sartre would agree with that. It may seem like a contradiction, but it only seems like as much of a contradiction as it is to say that I'm responsible for my emotions, even though they're in the non-reflective plane. So yeah, it's probably just that things make themselves. I'm still responsible when things make themselves, but it's happening when I'm not paying attention to it. That's scary. That's a lot of responsibility. For instance, we should recognize that emotion does not exist, considered as a physical phenomenon, for a body cannot be emotional, not being able to attribute a meaning to its own manifestations, a signification and interpretation. And think about attribute as well as, we attribute a meaning, but we also interpret a meaning based on things we don't always have control of. Psychology will immediately look for something beyond the vascular or respiratory disturbances. There's something beyond being the meaning of the joy or sadness, but since this meaning is precisely not a quality superposed from without upon the joy or of the sadness, since it exists only to the degree that it appears, namely, to which it is assumed by the human reality to which I make it mine from within. It is the consciousness itself that is to be interrogated. For joy is joy only insofar as it appears as such. And precisely because psychology is not looking for facts, but for their significations, it will abandon the method of inductive introspection or empirical external observation and seek only to grasp and to fix the essence of the phenomena. Psychology, too, will then offer itself as an eidetic science, only it will not be aiming, through study of the psychic phenomena, at what is ultimately signified, which is indeed the totality of man. It does not dispose of sufficient means to attempt that study. So all the sciences can become eidetic sciences, um, but they won't become the central eidetics, the pure phenomenology. It does not dispose of sufficient means to attempt that study. What will interest it, however, and this alone, is the phenomenon in inasmuch as it signifies. Just so, I might seek to grasp the essence of the proletariat through the word proletariat. In that case, I should be doing sociology. But the linguist studies the word proletariat insofar as it means proletariat, and will be worrying himself about the vicissitudes of the word as a transmitter of meaning. So I mean, that's a tough uh, clarification for even me to parse, but seeing the essence through the word, not the word in a history or the word in play with all of its different puppeteering and shadow figures, but the eidetics of the insight of studying. And I would think that you wouldn't just study the word proletariat, you'd also study the features of the proletariat, which are much more than just the mere nominalistic word. But I think that's the argument he's trying to make there. Um, Such a science is perfectly possible. What is lacking for it to become real, to have proved itself? We have seen that if the human reality appears to the psychologist as a collection of heteroclite data, this is because the psychologist has voluntarily placed himself upon the terrain where the human reality must look to him like that. But this does not necessarily imply that the human reality is anything else but a collection. What we have proved is only that it cannot appear otherwise to the psychologist. We have yet to see whether it will bear to the depths of phenomenological investigation. Whether emotion, for instance, is in truth a phenomenon that signifies. To come clear about this, there is only one way, that which, moreover, the phenomenologist himself recommends, to quote, go to the things themselves. May the following pages be regarded as an experiment in phenomenological psychology. We shall try to place ourselves upon the terrain of signification and to treat emotion as a phenomenon. All right, I thought we'd get through part 1 and 2 in this video, and we didn't, and that's totally okay. In part 1, he's going to critique the classic theories, William James and uh, Janet. I forget Janet's first name. Um, but Janet's theory, James's theory that the body causes the minds, or that he presents them in different ways, and he takes them to be representative of a collection of theories. Um, the one that says that the body causes the mind can be reduced to James, but it's more specifically understood as the idea that consciousness is the body's self-awareness, which is a little bit perhaps what Whitehead might say about prehensions and um, apprehensions. When we apprehend the world's prehensions, that's like the quantum matter becoming self-aware. It'd be interesting to see if if quantum matter as a self-aware feeling thing can be the human reality that allows consciousness. Without succumbing to his criticisms of James. And um, yeah, I think it could. He has some other criticisms about like consciousness not being just a pure feeling. And really, he means that we have an agency and we have intellect and we have responsibility. And these are not purely passive mechanistic productions. Um, I think what we really want to see is the simultaneity of the production process and then take ownership over it. To see the simultaneity of the active of ourself with the passive of the quote world, see that they're the same, and then we can own more of the passive world as active agency. And I think that is Sartre's goal. But it's a sort of dialectical monism, pluralistic monism, and it's called a dualism, but it's more complicated than that, clearly. And he'll criticize Janet for not giving consciousness this agency. He says that it's still just a mechanistic theory, even though it tries to bring some qualia or conscious contour or the kind of ephemerality, the magic is what Sartre will eventually use for this word. Even though Janet tries to bring a place for consciousness proper magic back into um, the account because it's a breakdown of adaptations at a fail point, it's still mechanistic. It's just a kind of the track diverts off, basically. Um, in fact, that's why he doesn't use the word diversion when it comes to a transformation of the world, because it's not a diversion. Um, it's a diversion insofar as we're trying to avoid facing responsibility or facing the thing causing the fear or the thing causing the sadness, but it's not a diversion of a passive neural system that we don't control. And that's his critique of Janet. And I think it's after that that he has a bunch of other people I don't really mention in the guiding questions. There's a long excerpt from Dembo, or it's not from Dembo, but a long excerpt from uh, P. Guillaume, Guillaume, and Guillaume quotes and references and presents Lewin and Dimbo. And so he uses this excerpt from Guillaume, I don't know, to kind of process all three theories. And he gets to this idea that anger is a way of avoiding impotence while being rationally goal oriented. It's not a break, and it's also not um, the reason it can't also be a diversion or a breakdown of capability or breakdown of adaptation, aside from it being mechanistic like James, is that emotion would not have a coherent feeling, whereas emotion always has a coherent feeling. Like our perceptions, coherences are the constant refreshing of the emotional felt nature of things. Um, and that's the finality. That's kind of our first guiding question for the next part and why it's important to think about finality, but it doesn't come up until the end of the chapter. Um, and then section two, chapter two, section two, whatever. He calls this one long essay. So, section two is a critique of psychoanalysis. Um, we do get the continuous transformation of form in the first section as well from out of Giame. Um, and that becomes important to the argument for the critique of the unconscious or the necessity of signification or consciousness to involve the non-reflective plane instead of the unconscious as being some aspect of the mind that we will never be able to access. We always have to be able to access the production process of the adumbration or the adumbrated production process of the givenness of the world. It's always all on the surface. And if you remember that, a lot of the arguments do make sense. And they're really fascinating. Um, so we're at 80 minutes, 82 minutes. We are maybe with the pauses a little bit less, but I'm not gonna yeah, again, he critiques psychoanalysis for separating the consciousness, for separating the signification process from um the conscious given, the appearance in consciousness. So I'm craving Brooklyn pizza right now. Like margarita pizza. That's not an alcoholic drink. Margarita pizza is spelled with an H and is one of the greatest things ever. It has fresh tomatoes and globs of mozzarella, and it's not covered in cheese. It doesn't have sauce. It's just like oil and sliced tomatoes and like thick mozzarella in chunks. Um, Here, I'll show you on the video. It can have sauce. A lot of times it does. When I make it, this one doesn't. When I make it at home, I don't put sauce. I like the fresh tomatoes. Like this, just two big slices of margarita. Sorry, that was the chef's kiss meme. I didn't mean it in like an Italian way. Um, because this is an Italian dish, but I remember my friend told me the funniest story. She went to, I don't know if it was New York or Chicago or something, but she wanted to get like meat and cheese on the pizza, and they're like looked at her like, that's excessive. That's way too much. You don't need all that. So I I love that vibe. I love the minimalist, good flavor. And Nino, a friend I made in Brooklyn, uh, if you're by Myrtle Tompkins, um, his name's Nino, but the place isn't called Nino's Pizza. I forget what it's called. Let me see. Myrtle Avenue J Stop Pizza. So there is that thing happening close by, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what I said. I said Myrtle Avenue Pizza, Brooklyn. I guess there's actually a place of worship there called the Holy Trinity. Um, I wonder if it's just a few more. It might be the stop further up. Because I remember Time Me. I've been to Time Me, but it was further down. Skytown was further down too. Yeah, I think it was right here. Millie's Pizzeria. That's definitely it. Yeah. This place is great. You guys should go there. He got his recipes like 20 something years ago from some other dude who got his recipes like 20 something years ago. And he just told me that pizza should be simple and it should be cheap. It should just be bread and sauce and cheese because it's meant to be a cheap, affordable, sustainable thing. And so it was like $2 or $3 to get a big slice, and you didn't need more than one or two of them. We did find a way to go almost to 90 minutes. So hope you enjoyed the pizza anecdote. And I went to my food bank today. It's another thing I didn't mention. And they have these frozen baguettes that you can like proof and bake. And I proofed one and then I like stretched it out into it's in a baguette shape, but I stretched it out into a pizza shape, into a disc. And then I put tikka masala curry on it that I made and froze a couple months ago. Um, and then some cheese. And it was okay. It's kind of burnt on around the edges. I might do less sauce, cook it for longer on lower, maybe 350 instead of 550. 550 is probably way too high. Um, and I'm trying not to buy ingredients, so I'm having a hard time getting like fresh tomatoes right now, but I'd love to have some fresh tomatoes for a pizza. I do have pepperonis from the bank and lots of other good stuff. They have a ton of stuff there. It's a food bank at one of the schools I work at. Um, and in that class, I only teach one student. I had two students, but one stopped coming. And just like immediately for some reason, it's really strange. Um, I don't know. I assume they're safe, but I worry about it. I messaged them and never heard back. So, um, anyway, yeah, when you like teach below a certain number of students, you don't make the same amount, but there are other ways that I get what I need. So we'll keep at the Sartre. I'm like a little fried on it because I've been at it for so long, but I think we can just read. Try to do one more tonight. So I think the issue is that I'm like forcing myself to, and then it's, you know, and then I do all this stuff like, well, when I hear glimpses of my previous videos, I worry about the way I sound. I feel like I just don't like hearing my own voice. I never know how it's coming across. Miss a slice, miss a Brooklyn slice, that's for sure. Thank you guys for being here. Um, no animal tax right now. I'll be back. See you soon.